Without further ado, we can get things started.
Right. Thank you so much, Haley. As mentioned, I am not Carrie Staten. I am Becca Phillips, and I'm the Outreach and Education Manager with the Brownfields Assistance Center, as well as Mid-Atlantic TAB. And both of these programs are under the Water Research Institute. So we're all in this beautiful department together. And I will let Pat Ford introduce himself now.
Good morning, and thank you, Becca. I'm Pat Ford. I'm the city manager for the city of Bridgeport, West Virginia. And formerly, prior to this job, I was the executive director of the Business Development Corporation of the Northern Panhandle, the lead economic development agency for the northern panhandle of West Virginia. And that's really where I began cutting my teeth on riverfront development and brownfield development. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, before we dive into the case study, I'm going to give just a quick introduction to what brownfields are, and then we'll go into the case study and finish with the conclusion and any other questions that come up. So to get started, the US EPA defines a brownfield as a property where expansion, redevelopment, or reuse may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So some of the common kinds of brownfields you'll see are abandoned railways, old gas stations, former auto shops, buildings with asbestos or lead, and then also, if it's adjacent to a brownfield, it's also a brownfield. So there are a lot of different benefits to cleaning up and then redeveloping these properties. It gets those contaminants out of the environment, so that's a public health benefit. It also helps to preserve green space and prevent sprawl, because you're reusing property that has already been developed, and a lot of times those are in kind of the center of like a downtown or someplace that already has good infrastructure in place. So it is really helpful to keep some of that kind of localized and reuse things that we already have. It also increases property values and eliminates eyesores from these dilapidated buildings. And then it creates new local jobs, which enhances the local economy and tax-based development. And then, of course, you're turning something that's potentially a liability to public health and safety into a community asset that's actually giving back and put into productive reuse. The redevelopment process when it comes to brownfields generally has 6 different parts. There's identifying the site, so realizing this is a brownfield, and then assessing the site for what kind of environmental contaminants may be present, doing planning as well as design for what that reuse might look like at the end, figuring out your project financing, which is one of the biggest challenges and also something that this case study does a really good job of. And then there's the cleanup or remediation. And finally, any other redevelopment aspects like new construction, things like that. The Brownfields Assistance Center and Mid-Atlantic TAB are the kinds of assistance that our office provides here. And some of the services we have are general education. So we'll do webinars, other trainings, not just online, but also in communities. The Brownfields Assistance Center serves West Virginia, but Mid-Atlantic TAB serves the entire region. So that would include Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. We also have monthly newsletters that include like news from around the state or region, respectively, depending on which one. And then also we help people to identify different resources. We can help with grant writing particularly for EPA Brownfields grants. That's our specialty. Reviewing grants, and then resource roadmaps, like finding funding that's particular to whatever redevelopment you're doing. We also help with local brownfield program support. So if a community hasn't done anything yet with brownfields, we can help them with the inventory to figure out what's going on, and have that information ready to go, as well as just answering any questions and identifying brownfields. And then finally, we help as well with project development and design assistance. Everything is free, so you can reach out to any of us to get a hold of these services. All right, and with that, I am going to turn things over to Pat to tell us more about the case study of Taylor Smith and Taylor, TS&T, the former pottery site.
Thank you very much, Becca. And as always, when I speak with the Assistant Center, I always hear something new that makes me reflect on my brownfield development career. And I would be remiss without saying that I've actually been developing along the rivers for probably some 30 years. But the first 20 years of my career, when I was doing work for Baltimore Inner Harbor, and then the next 10 years generically working on the riverfronts in Pittsburgh along the three rivers, Allegheny, Monongahela, and the Ohio. What's interesting, when you're working in those larger cities, you don't have any of those challenges because they're so flush with money. So all of those services and all of those benefits, you really don't think that there is not a benefit because there's so much money in those larger cities. Where it becomes an issue is in those smaller cities and the secondary and tertiary markets, like we have to deal with in the northern panhandle of West Virginia, which is in Appalachia. It's along the Ohio River, and it is scattered with just a number of abandoned brownfield properties. And we don't have money. Most of the communities in Appalachia, most of the communities in the Ohio River Valley don't have the resources, both financial, technical, or political, that one might have in a Philadelphia, Boston, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, places of that nature. So with that said, when I became executive director of the Business Development Corporation of the Northern Panhandle, unlike my positions in Pittsburgh, unlike my positions in Baltimore, I only had a budget, an operating budget, by the way, no capital reserves, but I had an operating budget of maybe $175,000 a year, no money in the bank, and literally just a postage stamp lot that we out in the middle of a large abandoned steel site that was literally just a former bar that had no end use in mind. So we had no money, no resources, no political connectivity for leverage. And yet at the time, we had the highest unemployment rate in the history of the Northern Panhandle, probably one of the highest unemployment rates in the state of West Virginia and the Ohio River Valley. And this was at about I'd say between 2009 and 2011 or 12. Yet they were seeing prosperity in other parts of Ohio, other parts of Pennsylvania, and the southern part of West Virginia. So we were trying to figure out a way. There had just been a recent plethora of announcements of industries and businesses closing because of the economy, because there was no available ground to develop. And quite frankly, we just didn't know what to do. And then someone came to me at the time and basically said, we won't be able to do anything until we get land, number one. And number two, the only real estate we have are brownfields. And of all of the brownfields, the only site that we really had even a shot of entering into a discussion was with regards to this former Taylor Smith and Taylor Pottery site, which was very close at the time to being entered into the Superfund program. So of all the sites that we chose to start our initiative with, was the dirtiest site in the entire Northern Panhandle of West Virginia, a former pottery site. And you can see the picture of it on the slide deck. And The challenge there, though, is that when you work in a Pittsburgh, when you work in a Baltimore or any of these other large cities, you don't look at a site and think, gosh, how do we even get started? Because who's going to help us do it? How much money it's going to cost? Because money's not an issue. These are entitlement cities, and they already have not only front end money to characterize the site, they have an entire staff to come up with a plan for a site, and they also have a public works department to help you procure contractors to do the development. I didn't have any of that. It was myself and 2 part-time employees. And so we needed capacity that emulated or rivaled some of these larger cities just to be able to have a shot at doing something on this site. And that's where our friends at the Brownfields Assistance Center came in and helped us with some of the seed money that they had through a relationship that they had with the Benedum Foundation to really start helping us add capacity to our small office, our small community, to really start generating momentum to do something with that site. Beck, would you like to go to the next slide? So with that said, this is the site after it was cleaned up. I mean, and you can see, and most of the sites that you see in the Ohio River Valley or these older industrial regions, and a lot of these factories, and you will see factories in some of the areas that I just mentioned today that date back into the 1900s, because there is this stigma associated with brownfields that you don't want to touch it. You don't want to get a partner involved because you don't want to be stuck with any of the environmental liability that would be associated with it. And it was a small site. And like all industrial sites in the Ohio River Valley, that's where the resource was, which is the river. And that's where a lot of the underground resources that were used for the manufacturing of either the metals, the potteries, the gases, the chemicals, all of them were literally along the river, and again, unlike some of our newer cities, the industries and the communities had their back to the river as opposed to facing the river. So with that said, this is the site that we inherited. It was attractive, and we saw nothing but opportunities, but we still were having a hard time figuring out what that opportunity was, other than it was just on the river and right along US 30. You can go to the next slide. So when you look at this site and when you go into the weeds a little bit, it really is not any different than most small towns in the Ohio River Valley. It was a small mill town. And not only are you dealing with the optics of having an abandoned factory, usually when these communities were built around the mills, when things were good at the mill, things were good in the community. When things went south in the mill, things went south in the community. So the communities ebbed and flowed with the community. So not only were you dealing with a large abandoned, dilapidated building of the mill that had been vacant for some 30, 40 years, you're also dealing with some abandonment issues on some of the houses and some of the other commercial buildings that were accessory or ancillary or benefited from the bill, from the buildings that were slowly deteriorating. And with that, because of the construction, because of the type of work that they did, like this pottery site, you became accustomed with being able to communicate with your partners exactly what contamination is. We can all broadly talk that, oh, it's contaminated, but when you start working through what contamination really is, you have to treat different types of contamination differently. So you really have to dive into the weeds and learn that, well, at a pottery factory, if they had any colors, there was cobalt that went into making blue, there's uranium with yellow, there's arsenic with red, and then you got lead, then you got asbestos, you got PCBs. I didn't know any of this because when you're in a larger city, you have people to handle this. But most of the communities that are dealing with these abandoned sites, it was just like me, one person. And so you quickly needed to figure out how you could add to your bench, get bench depth, and get capacity through technical assistance folks and resources to quickly identify what it is that's contaminating the property, and based on that, how you get a line of sight in terms of fixing it, particularly when you have no money. So next slide. So with that said, I will say that there was a grand master plan in terms of how to put together my capital stack to solve this problem. But I will also tell you that relationships and luck go a long ways in the economic development business. And because of the relationships that we had with our regional metropolitan planning organization, the Brooke Hancock Jefferson Planning Commission, and the relationship that I had with the Brownfields Assistance Center, they were able to add the capacity to give me someone to talk to figure out how we start this, how we generate interest in this, how we add capacity and build a team to really jump into this project, because it would be a heavy lift. And so again, I was new in the area, so someone from the Brownfields Assistance Center and the Metropolitan Planning Organization said, you know what, I know that there's a lot of people who might want to help out with this. And me personally, having not been a big fan of some of the larger community visiting sessions, because a lot of times I always felt like those sessions created false hope, and everybody would get organized, people would show up, but then there wouldn't be any follow-up. And so you'd end up with a worse situation than you inherited, because you created false hope with the idea that you had the capacity to take it to the next step. But quite frankly, I learned differently from working with the Brownfields Assistance Center. So what they were able to do is start a program, and they were mini grants, focus grants. And Becca, what did the focus stand for?
I'm not sure, but we
Or
can ask
Carrie might.
Carrie to type it in the chat.
All right, there you go. But because Brownfields Assistance Center, they always a great idea mill to come up with acronyms. But these focus grants were really just that. It's really focusing on what it is that you need to do to start generating interest. So with this $5,000 mini grant, we decided to have this community visioning and engagement work session. And what was really nice about this opportunity is, because this abandoned factory, was right on everybody's doorstep and had been abandoned for years, everybody complained about it. Everybody had a narrative as to why it shut down. Everybody had a narrative as to why it couldn't open up, whether it was the family who owned it, whether it was the environmental. Everybody had an excuse as to why nothing happened, but no one really sat down to talk about it. And quite frankly, for someone like me, someone like our elected officials, because you get so caught up in your day-to-day business that you really never slow down to really get people in a room to start sharing thoughts and ideas, just to ground truth some of the rumors, number one, or two, start brainstorming about how it is that we could work together to fix it. And so that $5,000 mini grant gave us that opportunity to really kick off this project. So for me and my staff and some of the elected officials, who quite frankly had 2 or 3 generations, and some of them even longer, in the northern Hancock County, Chester area, it was the first time that they had actually come to the table and communicated with some of their neighbors or some of their elected officials, or let alone the development official or someone from the Brownfields Assistance Center. So what came out of that was a lot of very positive energy. And also a lot of donuts, because there was this small bakery there, Frank's Pastries. It's still one of my favorite pastry shops, probably in the country. And with that said, over coffee and donuts one night in a shelter in a park that was right next to the factory, we actually started getting very positive feedback from the community and the elected officials that really traded. It gives opportunity to really trade some ideas, and the energy was so positive that I heard something come out of a county commissioner's mouth that I had never heard come out of an elected official's mouth at a local level in probably 20 years. And he was so amped up about it. It was Mike Swartzmill. I'll never forget this. And Becca, I don't even think I told you this, but this county commissioner said, "This is such an important project. And now I understand why it's important, because people have had relatives, family members, friends going back generations who worked there, that he said that he will do whatever it takes to buy his way out of this problem." An elected official said, "We will buy our way out of this problem." And with that momentum, then came his, "That's a bold statement." And now all of a sudden, you're creating what I'm always wanting to tap the brakes on, this hope now in the community that there is hope to fix this. And so, because there was so much positive energy, we ended up getting another focus grant to really start diving into the weeds a little bit. And again, so up to this point, I don't have the money. So we were able to, with that $5,000, really come up with some ideas and a plan and reuse options. But more important, we actually had political ownership in this site. And with that said, now how do we capture that? How do we bottle that so we can take it somewhere and plant it and grow that? And so that's where we made the pitch for the next mini grant a year later for $12,000. And it was with that money that we used to familiarize all of us with what our larger partners at the state and federal level could do. And again, when I was in Pittsburgh, when I was in Baltimore, you were already connected politically, or you had lobbyists, you had someone who knew someone. So you really, dots were automatically connected because you inherited the connectivity. So you never really had to work at it. Again, I'm still now just one person. We have the Brownfields Assistance Center that had just started developing their relationships. We needed to now dive into where those resources were that we could count on to help us on the front end to acquire the site, and then, or excuse me, assess the site, acquire the site, and then start preparing that site. And that's where they made an introduction to us. And I'll never forget this. They scheduled a trip to Philadelphia in Region 3 to meet with a number of subject matter experts in US EPA. And by the way, this was the first time I'd met with someone who I would categorize as a federal regulatory authority. And because my experience with regulators, it was nothing good. Not that I did anything bad, but you just never hear the narrative with regards to what it is that they do. And it was the most pleasant, engaging, rewarding meeting that I'd ever had with a federal agency in my career up to that point. And it's there that they helped us get our head around what these nice fancy words are, all appropriate inquiries, bona fide prospective purchasers, the things that we needed to do before we acquired it. What a phase one and phase two is. I never knew what a phase one and phase two was because we had people who did all of that before we actually acquired property. So then they walked us through the front end money that is required to acquire a site, characterize a site, and plan a site. And by the way, the very programs that we were talking about in 2011 and 2012 are the same programs that are out there today. And so it was just really comforting, exciting to begin now matching a visioning and community engagement outcome with a funding strategy to really secure us that now this really wasn't hope, that there actually is an end game here that's made possible for a community that had little or no resources like us. And so we were able to use that mini grant to get our head around a phase one, phase two, bring reality to a vision and community engagement process, and also do a very preliminary market analysis to to again, ground truth. Also, some of the ideas that came out of the community engagement process. Next slide, please. So this is where, again, leaning into your partners at the Regional Planning and Development Council and the Brownfields Assistance Center, we were able to do the phase one. And guess what? Once you start learning what a brownfield is, it usually it's right. I still choke on it when I read these words, because the fact of the matter is that's what was in the ground: asbestos, arsenic, lead, other materials, iron, and all those other fancy acronyms. But the fact of the matter is that's all bad stuff, right? That's all bad stuff. And when I see that, it makes me realize this is why we have so many abandoned factories all over our country, even to this day, is that there are still banks, there are still attorneys, there's still people who don't have the appetite. There are elected officials that don't have the appetite. People would rather just go find a green field and do their business instead of having to deal with stuff like that. But again, you need to know, and you need to go in wide open. And the beautiful thing about the EPA is that they will help you characterize it. There's a happy side to EPA that people, I always like to say that all of EPA is happy people, but the fact of the matter is they were so engaging. And when they knew that we wanted to solve it, they were solve the problem and fix it and clean it up and prepare the site. They were equally excited to help us find an avenue to further characterize the site and also begin addressing these contaminants. Next slide, please. So that's when we realized that, okay, now that we have everything figured out, what do we do? And again, EPA, to their word, and to this day, they have programs set up to begin cleaning up a problem that they helped you identify and also funded the identification of the problem. That's what I found out with all federal agencies. If they help you identify a problem, if they help you clean up a problem, they're going to help you correct and see that end game through. And sure enough, they stepped up. They helped us with our first cleanup grants to begin addressing the asbestos, the lead, which again, in the pottery, and I will say this is just one of those things you don't think about, but in the early 1900s, the way they got rid of their old plates that had lead, arsenic, uranium, asbestos, they would just throw all the plates into the river. For decades, that Ohio River was filled with pottery shards. So not only, and again, I didn't know that, didn't think about it, but when they started looking at all the shards along the hillside, then they thought, oh, if they did this along the hillside, they probably just didn't have a good enough arm to make it to the river. So sure enough, they started digging around the river and they found pottery shards. But they helped us work and come up with creative ways, by the way, to get enough money, because back in those days, the pots of money for cleanup were very small. It was $200,000. If you weren't fully funded, it was $100,000. But we came up with very creative ways to bifurcate the site to get cleanup dollars to be able to clean up the river, clean up the river bank, clean up the flat area. And what was also cool is that if you had engagement, this goes back to that important engagement with the elected officials. They even loaned us the money for the match money that was required for the grants that we got from the US EPA. So we still now at that time had not put $1 into it. And we were able to use these technical assistance programs, the mini grants and commitments, not grants so don't be afraid of a loan. Because again, we were able to pay that loan back once we started getting revenue on the property. And so now we were able to plan, assess, clean up, and we still hadn't put in $1 of our own money. And by the way, I'd be remiss without throwing a shout out to our Department of Environmental Protection. All states have a voluntary remediation program. In Ohio, it's It's VAP in Pennsylvania, it's Act 2, West Virginia, it's the VRP. I've worked with all those programs, and they're basically all the same. It's nice to enter it into their program because then the feds will defer that regulatory oversight to the states, but you want to keep the feds involved because they have the larger pots of money, and eventually the states will get the money to help with that too. So it's really nice and comforting to have your state Environmental Protection Agency and the US EPA work with you to help you assess, acquire, and begin repurposing the site. Next slide, please. So again, the next step is now that you've got the site curated, you have a line of sight with regards to now what this site could look like, or what the future could look like when it grows up. You really needed to start getting your head around exactly what that looks like, and also, quite frankly, the cost. And again, when you get to this now, you're 2 years into it, you see the visioning work session in 2013. I will always tell anybody who gets into this brownfield space, you need to be prepared for the long game, and you also need to institute what I call the power of 10. When you jump into a project like this, you always need to have an idea of what your first 10 stories are that you're going to tell people as to what you're going to do. Not 10 different plans, but 10 different stories with regards to how you're going to get to that end game. And so with that said, up to that point, the narrative was all about visioning, community engagement, site control, collaboration. But now you really needed to get into the site-specific planning and financing. Again, not having any money, not having any political or capacity resources to be able to pay engineers, architects, whoever it might be. We had another community visioning workshop that helped us really start refining what that use would be. And we also knew at the time, for us, since we were an economic development agency, it had to have a jobs component. It had to have an investment component. We needed to make money because we still owed, we borrowed a good chunk of money from our county commissioners. I think it was about $500,000 that we knew that we had to pay back. So there had to be an investment jobs component. So the focus of that next community visioning workshop was to come up with what economically viable uses we could start planning on this site, which ones would be feasible. So for example, we weren't going to be building a large 10-story glass veneered office building like in Pittsburgh there, right? We knew that we weren't going to be putting in an automotive plant on 8 acres, but what was that mix of uses that we could put there that we knew could be developed? And at the same time, understanding the greater importance of the community, since they were undergoing revitalization, how do we create some connectivity of the site with the neighborhood along the riverfront? So while we're developing this site for industrial uses, making sure that we had public connections from the roads, sidewalks, riverfront access. So there was connectivity from the downtown, because the way the trajectory of this site was, it was the downtown, it was the factory, and then it was the neighborhood, because people lived close to where they worked back in the early 1900s. So we wanted to make sure that there was connectivity both along the river and on the east side of the site, along State Route 2, for both roads, for road and car access, and also bikes and people access through the site to connect all 3 sectors of the northern part of Chester. Next slide, please. So again, with the challenges, but again, as I've always said, when you don't have money and you have challenges, you have to think. And also, when you don't have capacity, you need partners to help you with that process. Part of the assessment money that we received, and the supplemental assessments that we also received from US EPA, and the cleanup money, it now gave us the resources that we needed to hire a very reputable engineering company, CEC, to help us come up with the game plan. And when you start now coming up with a game plan in terms of what that end use is going to be, now you start getting an idea of what challenges come with developing along the riverfront. You have water table issues. You have possibilities where some of those contaminants that are underground might be leaching into the groundwater, leaching into the river. And what type of engineering barriers do you need to put into the ground, not only below the ground, but also above the ground? How do you cap? How do you prevent further leaching? And then at the same time, create an opportunity where people can construct pads, footers, and things of that nature on the site. And that's where you really need someone, an engineering company that has both a civil and environmental component to help you with preparing that site for those end uses. And again, thanks to the money that we received from the US EPA, we were able to do that. Next slide, please. And then that's when I learned about mussels. Those aren't just something that are served on the table in fast food restaurants. Those are something that also can be found in the Ohio River. And guess what? We can't just go in there into the river. Again, this is my simple vernacular. You can't go into the river and just scoop up the mussels and just put them downriver. In between all of these little mussels are lots of pottery shards, all of them which have all of the colors and the contaminants that we mentioned earlier. But again, thanks to the US EPA and them being able to rescue us, we were able to pay for a mussel survey. And we were also paid, given the money to relocate the mussels and at the same time clean up the portion of the river. And what's also important to note, our obligation, because it is the Ohio River, our obligation wasn't to clean up 100 years of migration of the contaminants. It was our obligation was only to clean up the contaminants in the river, the width of our property, and that was it. So next slide, please. Now that we had grown our team, the capacity, both politically, financially, our support not only went to Philadelphia at Region 3, but now we had been able to get support to the US DOT, and we also had support now in the governor's office, where we were going to build the first spec building that was built in the state of West Virginia for probably 10 years. And so they gave us a loan, a non-interest loan, to build that spec building for it was north of $1 million. And because they believed in it, because the county believed in it, the city believed in it, the residents believed in it, US EPA believed in it, we were able to then secure the funds to build this building. And I will tell you, all of those people there reflect what I've learned in this business. And that is, when you develop a brownfield, you have to be patient, because it took 14 different funding streams to do this, and 14 different funding streams, and we did not put in $1 of our own money. And every shovel that you see in that picture was someone who had their skin in this project, their money, or their political contributions and their political support for that. And because of those efforts, going back to, you remember 2011, here it is in 2018, 2017, we received the funds secured to build it, and then we received an award and a certificate of completion in 2018 from DEP. So again, once a brownfield, always a brownfield. So there are contaminants on the property below the cap, but they worked with us to come up with a way to dig and build this facility. Next slide, please. And there's your timeline, 2011 to 2018. And what's really nice about this program is I wouldn't want anybody who's listening to this to think that this was just a one-off luck, stars were aligned. What was really interesting about this program and this process is we did it in such a way, with the help from the Assistance Center and the US EPA, that this process is replicatable. We ended up using this exact same process. The funding streams might have been a little different. The Brownfields Assistance Centers programs became a lot more robust, much more robust today. Their political connections, their regulatory connections, their connections with Charleston, the state capital, and Washington and Philadelphia are much more robust and strengthened. So those nuances might change, but the fact of the matter is the process is still the same and it's still replicatable. And the US EPA is still the only federal agency that provides front-end money for assessment, acquisition, and remediation. You will not find any other program in the federal government that provides front-end money so accessibly and so easily as the US EPA. Next slide. So there's your capital stack there. $5.9 million, $500,000 from the US EPA. The development office kicked in $3,300. The assistance center through their mini grants, $40,000. West Virginia Hub, another nonprofit, $2,500. The loan from the Hancock County Commission, about $500,000. The BDC's money at $245. That money right there came from some of our investors that ended up getting that money back. The IJDC grant, DOT grant, EDA loan. And by the way, when that business came in to locate there, and there's a business there today, we were able to pay that back. That was a non-interest, and we did not have to pay that back because, and again, that's nice about borrowing money from public agency. They have a lot more flexibility than conventional banks. So we were able to pay back that note to them. And then the additional $2.2 million from United Bank, that was for improvements, and the rent that we got from the buildings was able to pay the debt service for that. So again, a 100% financed $5.9 million investment that was financed, and everybody was made whole on that project. And there's your project partners and people that were committed to the funding stream or the regulatory stream where we needed assistance. And there it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's 10 of the partners. Some of the funding, some of those partners had multiple funding streams, but that's the team that was necessary to do this. And quite frankly, the same team members that are required for any successful economic or community development project, particularly if it's a brownfield. Next slide. Conclusion. Becca, I've been talking a lot. You added a lot of capacity. Maybe you might want to talk about creativity and collaboration and how basically not to give up. You want to take a shot at that?
Sure, absolutely. So as this case study demonstrates, it's important to collaborate. I think that's one of the most important things, that without all of those connections, it would have been difficult or even impossible to be able to get some of those funding streams and into some of those programs because you wouldn't have known about them. Next, creativity was also very important because while this brownfields are a land program, it was used to help clean up the waterfront. So you don't need to change your message or your project. I mean, you don't need to change your project, but you could just get the message to line up with whatever grant you're applying for, to get things cleaned up. And then finally, don't give up. It took 7 years to get from purchasing the property to getting that certificate of completion from DEP. And that took a lot of continuous momentum. A lot of those different project partners were involved with, keeping things going in the media and attending and advertising like all of the public meetings and community visioning sessions and getting the community involved. So if anyone had lost the momentum, this project may not have come to fruition, but because the BDC especially kept kept on track, it was able to be completed. And this is a picture of what that looks like now.
Yeah. And I will just say to Becca's point about not giving up, you know, it's interesting, you know, if this is your first brownfield project, or if you've never tackled a project of this magnitude, what's interesting and important about not giving up is that because we had such positive energy around that site, because we had developed those relationships with people at the local, state, and the federal level, it started giving hope, which eventually turned to confidence in nearby communities. So once we were able to illustrate that we weren't afraid of a brownfield, we understood a brownfield, we understood that there could be an end game to a brownfield, we used this replicatable approach, if that's a word or a phrase, to then begin tackling pottery factories in New Cumberland, steel mills in Weirton, another steel mill in Follansbee, a glass factory in Wellsburg, another steel mill in Beach Bottom, and then that became so easy that city council and mayors who were having problems with abandoned houses along the river, the Brownfields Assistance Center came up with this program called the Bad Building Program. Brownfield, abandoned, and dilapidated. So we had generated so much interest and capacity that we literally, as an economic development agency, started sliding into the space of helping with the nuisance property programs. And with our relationships with the banks, we were able to work with banks and also the Assistance Center to begin rolling out a program to assessing, acquiring, and demolishing abandoned houses. So don't think that there's going to be a lot of lag time, because again, people want to be part of a success story. So by being vigilant with just the TS&T, people really started leaning into us as subject matter experts for all brownfields. And our plate, and the plate of the BDC to this day, and I'm no longer there, is still consumed with doing brownfield projects.
All right. Thank you so much, Pat and Becca. That was a really cool story to get here, see it all come together, all the components that go into it. Now is time for questions. Yes, as Carrie said, drop your questions in the chat. You can raise your hand at the bottom of the screen. And you can unmute and yeah, we want this to be very discussion oriented. So, any questions you have from that presentation for either of our presenters, for Carrie, please let us know.
I will say, Haley, if there are questions that come up later, I'd be more than happy to answer any of those too, and email those to you at a later date also.
Thank you.
Yes. And when we send out the slides, I will include contact information as well as how to connect with the Brownfields Assistance Center and Mid-Atlantic tabs. So if you're not in West Virginia, but you're still in the Mid-Atlantic region, we can help you out. We can get involved in your community.
Hello, Anna. I see Anna's name pop up there.
Hi, Pat. This was great. Thanks, everybody.
There you are.
I know we've got Anthony Clements here too.
Anthony.
Hey, Pat.
He's now the reigning director there. It's good to see you.
You too. I will say, so the BDC actually did a presentation on TS&T not too long ago for EPA, and the story of it was similar to kind of your final thoughts, Pat. Like this kickstarted BDC off on a very, very long path strategically for our strategic plan. It also has, I mean, we're no longer in just brownfields, but the takeaways from this project spurred into so much more because it really gives you the hands-on experience to understand what levers can be pulled and when, whether that be end use planning from some of these EPA assessment grants, whether that be going after technical assistance from other federal agencies, being able to pull together resources and partners, it lends itself to all other facets. And as the economic development organization, sometimes that's historic preservation, sometimes that's small business development, sometimes that's actually developing property yourselves or working with developers to do that. Sometimes it's just monitoring construction for the state in some of these giant state-funded projects. And again, this set the stage for everything that the BDC kind of does now.
I also like that quote Carrie put in there about what Mary Hunt said. I actually wrote that one down. I haven't used that one. I'm going to steal another quote from her or from people I work with. The planets don't just align. Sometimes you have to push them. That's great. And that's true.